The day you stop explaining is the day you become free. Have you ever noticed how the most powerful people in the room are often the quietest? They don't rush to explain themselves. They don't argue their worth. They don't apologize for their presence. And because of that, they're feared, respected. Not because they dominate, but because they withhold. You were taught that to be accepted, you had to be understood. So you've spent your life justifying, clarifying, over-explaining, trying to make others see you clearly, hoping that once they do, they'll finally approve. But here's the truth. Explanation is rarely about clarity. It's about control. It's the desperate attempt to manage someone's perception of you. And in doing so, you hand them power. Every time you explain your silence, your absence, your boundaries, you're telling the other person that they are entitled to your reasons, to your inner world, to your truth. They're not. The day you stop explaining is the day you stop performing. And when the performance ends, so does the manipulation. People don't control you with chains. They control you with your need to be understood. If they can get you to explain, they know they still own a piece of you. Because explanation is a kind of apology. It says, please don't misunderstand me. Please don't leave me. Please don't think badly of me. But what if they do? What if you let them? What if someone misunderstands your silence and you do nothing to correct them? That's power, because now they're left alone with their assumptions, and your silence becomes a mirror, forcing them to face their own projections. Carl Jung said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The people who demand explanations from you, they're not always asking to understand. They're asking to control. They want you to shrink, to soften, to soothe their discomfort. But what happens when you don't? They call you cold, arrogant, detached. Not because you are, but because they've lost access to the version of you that played along. Let them. Let them call you the villain. Let them write your character in their story however they need to. It doesn't make it true. What's true is this. You are not responsible for the story in someone else's head. You are not responsible for how they interpret your boundaries. You are not responsible for softening every edge of who you are, just to be palatable. When you finally stop explaining, you don't become cruel, you become clear. And clarity is terrifying for those who only knew how to control you through your confusion. So be misunderstood, be resented, be feared. If that's the cost of being sovereign, pay it. Because the day you stop explaining is the day you finally become free. They loved you when you were convenient. They didn't love you. They loved the version of you that was useful, the one who never said no, the one who listened without needing to be heard, the one who stayed quiet when disrespected, the one who bent, adapted, softened, forgave on demand. You became their comfort zone, their emotional sponge, their invisible scaffolding. And for a while you told yourself this was love, that their presence meant care, that their silence meant peace. That being needed meant being valued. But slowly you began to notice, the moment you stopped being convenient, you became difficult. The moment you set a boundary, you were selfish. The moment you prioritized your own needs, you were too much. That's when the truth breaks through. They never loved you. They loved what you gave them. They loved the version of you that served their comfort. Your compliance was mistaken for compatibility. Your exhaustion was mistaken for loyalty. Carl Jung said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And using you was easier than facing themselves. They didn't have to examine their behavior because you excused it. They didn't have to confront their needs because you fulfilled them. They didn't have to feel alone because you were always there. But the moment you stopped answering immediately, the moment you hesitated to comfort, the moment you expressed your needs, you became the enemy. Not because you changed, but because you stopped being a mirror. You stopped reflecting their fantasy, and they had to face reality. The backlash wasn't personal. It was structural. They were never relating to you. They were relating to the role you played. And when the role ends, so does the illusion. You see, some people don't want connection. They want control. They don't want intimacy. They want access. You were loved as long as you were predictable, as long as you didn't challenge their self-image, as long as you didn't disturb their emotional ecosystem. But growth always disturbs, healing always costs, and truth always offends those who are invested in the lie. So if they left when you said no, if they turned when you stood up for yourself, it wasn't your fault. It was your awakening. It's painful to realize how transactional some relationships were, how little of you was truly seen, how much was only used. But this is not a tragedy. This is your liberation. Because now you know, being loved for your compliance is not love. Being needed is not the same as being cherished. Being used is not the same as being known. And in letting go of those who only loved you when you were convenient, you make space for something far rarer, someone who can love you, even when you're inconvenient. Stop explaining. Start detaching. There comes a moment when you realize that every explanation you give is not a bridge to understanding, but a leash someone else holds. You keep talking, hoping they'll see your intentions. You clarify over and over, thinking that if they could just understand, the conflict would dissolve. But here's the truth. People rarely misunderstand you by accident. Misunderstanding is often strategic. It's control disguised as confusion. The more you explain, the more power you give away. You hand over your energy in neatly wrapped sentences, hoping for validation that never arrives. You become a performer in someone else's narrative, desperately trying to correct a story they've already decided to believe. And the more you explain, the more invisible you become. Because what they wanted was never clarity. It was compliance. Carl Jung warned us that the persona, the mask we wear to fit in, is not who we truly are. Every time you explain yourself to maintain peace, you reinforce that mask. You say, "It's not like that," when someone twists your words. You say, "I didn't mean to," when they weaponize your silence. But beneath each explanation lies fear, the fear of losing approval, of being seen as selfish, of being left. But think about this. If you must constantly explain your boundaries, are they really boundaries, or are they negotiations? Detachment isn't coldness, it's clarity. When you stop explaining, you give yourself permission to let the consequences unfold. You stop managing other people's perceptions. You step out of the courtroom where your character is always on trial, and you begin to choose peace over performance. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent or cruel. It means recognizing when a conversation is no longer a dialogue, but a test. It means knowing when your words are being twisted into tools against you. It means walking away not because you don't care, but because you finally do about yourself. There's a certain kind of silence that screams, not the silence of defeat, but of power. A silence that says, "I'm no longer available to be manipulated." A silence that draws boundaries sharper than words ever could. Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming whole, requires us to shed the layers we wear for acceptance. One of those layers is the compulsive need to be understood. But real freedom begins when you stop needing everyone to get it. When you realize that someone else's confusion is not your emergency, that their projections are not your truth, that your worth is not up for debate. So what happens when you stop explaining? The noise fades, the guilt lessens, and in the quiet, you meet a version of yourself who doesn't beg to be seen because they already are. By you. Stop explaining, start detaching. The ones who truly see you don't need the explanation, and the ones who demand it were never really listening. Individuation is the death of the persona. You were trained to perform. Since childhood, you learned how to smile on command, how to speak to be liked, how to shrink yourself to be accepted. You became whoever the moment required. The peacemaker, the achiever, the obedient one. You were taught that love is conditional, that belonging comes at the cost of authenticity. So you built a persona, not a mask you wear consciously, but a survival strategy. You smiled when you were hurt. You apologized when you were right. You agreed to avoid rejection. You became functional, reliable, pleasant. and completely disconnected from your own soul. Carl Jung called this the persona, the mask we present to the world. It is not inherently evil, it is necessary, but it becomes a prison when we mistake it for our true self. The persona keeps the peace, but it does so by silencing the inner voice. And here's the truth. The more you maintain the persona, the more the real you begins to die. Individuation, Jung said, is the process of becoming whole. And to become whole, you must first become separate. Separate from the roles, from the masks, from the false self you've spent your life curating. This is not self-improvement. It is self-recovery. It requires sacrifice. You will lose approval. You will disappoint expectations. You will confuse people who were attached to your act. But that's how you know it's working. The moment you stop performing, people start projecting. They say you've changed, that you're cold now, selfish, difficult, unrecognizable. They are not wrong. They simply never met the real you. Individuation is painful because it is the death of who you pretended to be. The death of the agreeable version of you, the obedient, convenient, digestible you. And the rebirth of the self is always met with resistance. Your silence will be called arrogance. Your boundaries will be called cruelty. Your refusal to explain yourself will be seen as disrespect. But none of that is your burden to carry. You are not here to be understood by everyone. You are here to become yourself fully. And that journey begins where the mask ends. So ask yourself, who are you when no one is watching? Who are you when you're not performing? That's the real you. And that self does not need to be explained. It only needs to be reclaimed. Villainy as sovereignty. They called you selfish when you started saying no. They called you cold when you stopped performing. They called you arrogant when you protected your peace. But what they really meant was, you're no longer easy to control, because the moment you withdraw your compliance, the illusion breaks. And suddenly, what they once labeled as kindness becomes defiance. What was once your compassion becomes rebellion. This is the moment. You are cast as the villain, not because you did harm, but because you stopped being convenient. Villainy is not about malice, it's about misalignment. It's what they call you when you no longer serve their narrative. Carl Jung wrote that the shadow is the part of ourselves we disown, deny, and repress. But the real twist is this. People project their shadows not only onto enemies, but especially onto those who no longer fit neatly into their expectations. You say no? They say you're cruel. You stop explaining. You must be hiding something. You leave the role. Now you're unstable. But this isn't about them. It's about reclaiming your sovereignty. Villainy, in this sense, becomes an act of power. It is the reclamation of your center. It is no longer asking for permission to be whole. It is the fierce choice to prioritize truth over image, clarity over comfort, peace over approval. To become the villain in someone else's story is to step into authorship of your own. You will be called names, misunderstood, judged. That is the tax you pay for authenticity. But what's the alternative? To stay in roles that suffocate you? To keep playing nice while eroding inside? To barter your voice for temporary belonging? No, the world doesn't need more obedient people. It needs more sovereign ones. Those willing to be misunderstood. Those brave enough to lose everything that was never real. Those who know that integrity sometimes wears the mask of the villain. So let them talk. Let them call you what they must. You are not here to be liked. You are here to be free. And freedom begins where compliance ends. The fear of being misunderstood is your leash. You keep over-explaining because you're afraid of being misunderstood. You over-apologize, clarify, soften your truth just to make others comfortable. Just to keep the peace, just to be seen as good. But here's the hard truth. The fear of being misunderstood is the leash that keeps you domesticated. You were taught that being liked is survival. That clarity guarantees connection. That if someone misunderstands you, you must fix it. But misunderstanding is not a threat. It's a test. Carl Jung wrote, "What you are is what you have always been, and what you have become is only a shell." And shells are loud. They echo every projection people throw at you. When you are deeply afraid of being misunderstood, you become easy to shape, easy to guilt, easy to control, because the world is not designed to reward truth. It rewards predictability. It rewards those who say what's expected, act how they should, and never disrupt the emotional economy of the group. So when you say something real, something raw, watch what happens. People recoil. They question your tone. They ask you to explain. They say you're too much, too intense, too cold, too emotional. What they really mean is you're not following the script, and every time you rush to correct their perception, you abandon your own. Let that sink in. Every time you try to be understood, you're negotiating your truth with someone else's comfort. And for what? A nod? A like? A temporary seat at a table where your real self is not welcome? No. The work is not to be understood. The work is to be clear with yourself, to know what you meant, to stand by it, to let people misinterpret you, misjudge you, mislabel you, and stay unmoved. That is power, because the need to be understood is rooted in childhood when your safety depended on someone getting you. But now your safety depends on your ability to stand alone in your truth. Some will never get it. They weren't supposed to. Some will twist it. Let them. Some will leave. Good. You are not a brand to be marketed. You are not a script to be edited. You are a sovereign self. And sovereign selves don't explain, they embody. They don't convince, they choose. They don't beg for understanding. They create from clarity. So the next time someone says, "I don't get you," look them in the eye and say, "You're not meant to." Becoming the villain to finally be free. There comes a moment quiet, slow, almost unremarkable, when you stop trying to be liked. And in that moment, something else enters freedom. Not the euphoric kind, not the Hollywood rebellion, but a quiet, weighty kind of freedom. One that comes with cost. One that doesn't look like joy at first, it looks like grief. Grief for the self you performed. Grief for the love that was never real. Grief for all the years spent being palatable, being digestible, being less. But after the grief comes fire, because when you let them think you're the villain, you are finally free to be real. Not good, not liked, not approved, just real. Carl Jung called this individuation the process of becoming a whole, integrated self. Not a persona, not a performance, but a being in alignment with the shadow, with the truth, with the soul. And this process, it will cost you everything fake. It will cost you the mask that made you lovable. It will cost you the relationships built on your obedience. It will cost you the validation that kept you small. But in return, you get yourself back. You stop walking on eggshells. You stop laughing at jokes that hurt. You stop shrinking to make others feel tall. You start saying no. You start saying not anymore. You start saying this is who I am, and silence is your only rebuttal. They will say you've changed. They're right. You changed because pretending was killing you. You're not here to be admired. You're here to live aligned, and alignment rarely looks like people-pleasing. So yes, let them talk. Let them call you selfish. Let them say you've become cold, difficult, distant. Let them paint you the villain in their story. It's better to be the villain in their lie than the ghost in your own life. Because when you become the villain, you're no longer on the stage of their play. You're in your own story. You're no longer cast as the helper, the fixer, the mirror. You're the main character now. And main characters don't beg for permission. They choose. They create. They stand. So this is your permission slip. Let go of being the good one. Let go of being understood. Let go of being available to every hand that reaches. Choose your peace. Choose your truth. Choose your edge. Because the real ones will find you in your truth, not in your performance. And the false ones will fall away the moment your mask does. That's how you know it's working. You have been taught to fear rejection, but rejection is a compass. It shows you who cannot meet your truth, who cannot walk with your depth, who cannot hold your shadow. Let them go. Let them gossip. Let them turn. Because you're not here to be convenient. You're here to be whole, and sometimes becoming whole requires becoming hated. So walk away, without guilt, without explanation, without softness for those who only loved your softness. Walk away and become who you were before the world told you who to be. Not the savior, not the saint, just you, raw, honest, misunderstood, and finally free.